Quick 1-minute boss guides for the Everbloom. Let's go. The first boss of this instance is Mr. Witherbark himself. This boss will be spawned once you defeat all 3 sets of trash that surround him. First things first, tanks, be sure to drag the boss to this corner here, and I'll explain why shortly. Tanks, get comfortable with the wall POV, but more importantly, be sure to use a defensive whenever the boss casts Parch Gasp. The rest of your party needs to steer clear of this since it is, well, a frontal cone. Witherbark will also target DPS and healers with unchecked growth, a swirl on the ground that should be avoided. The best strategy for this fight is to create a wall around the boss when he's residing in this corner. This is important because when the boss runs out of energy, he will enter a brittle state, causing him to take 100% increased damage until he reaches 100 energy again. During the intermission, aqueous globules will spawn from the far lake, slowly moving towards the boss. When these come in contact with him, he will gain 25 energy. Any big brain mathematician out there will be able to deduce that 4 globules touching the boss will end this intermission. So, in theory, you want to extend the intermission as long as possible for the most amount of damage. By pulling the boss away and by creating a wall of unchecked growths, this will give your group the most amount of time possible to do damage to the boss. Whenever the globules come in contact with the growths, it'll spawn small adds. Tanks need to be sure to pick up threat on these mobs, and the rest of your party should do as much damage as possible to the boss. Once 100 energy is restored, the boss will go back to slapping the tank and spawning more growths. Simply rinse and repeat. This is a unique council style boss fight. There are 3 total bosses, 2 which are stationary and cannot be moved. Tank will want to start by picking up Dolu and dragging him over to Earthshaper Telu. DPS players should aim to focus Telu since he can cause a lot of trouble for your group. Telu and Gola will both cast bolts at random party members. Stop this if you can, but be sure to save at least 1 kick for their special casts. For Telu, this is Toxic Bloom. If this cast gets off or finishes, it'll stun all party members for 4 seconds, which can quickly lead to a wipe. Gola, on the other hand, will cast Revitalize, which will heal one of the bosses for 10% of their max health. While disheartening, it's recoverable. Gola and Telu will take turns casting Torrential or Terrestrial Fury, which is basically a triage effect during the duration of the fight. DPS should use their defensives generously, and healers are really meant to focus on healing throughout this fight. Lastly, the movement of this fight is quite awkward for the tank. Every time Dolu casts Noxic Charge, you'll want to move away from other group members. Once the ability connects with the tank, large swirls will spawn under each player, causing almost lethal damage and leaving pools on the ground. Be sure to avoid this at all costs. I personally recommend having the entire group staying near Telu and then shifting to Gola every time a charge goes off. Or, I guess, just YOLO it. Archmage Sol is a pretty hectic fight, but once you understand the rotation of her abilities, it's actually pretty straightforward. Tanks, the bosses will rotate between 3 schools of magic that deal moderate damage to you. Mitigate this as much as you can. All 3 schools do the same amount of damage, they're just worded differently. Healers, just be sure to spot heal the tank whenever they dip low, because normally we mitigate boss auto attacks, not an onslaught of spells. As for her main abilities, she's going to rotate between Cinderbolt Storm, Glacial Fusion, and Spatial Compression. On top of all of that, a mirror image will replicate her most previously cast spell. Starting off, Sol will kick off the encounter with Cinderbolt Storm, a high amount of group damage. DPS players use the defensive here, and this is the ability that healers want to make sure they're prepared for. Next, Sol will cast Glacial Fusion on 2 players, which will spawn 2 rings of frozen spheres that will collapse inward. This won't deal any damage unless you get hit, which will stun the player and cause high ticking damage. Like I said earlier about the mirror image, on the first Glacial Infusion, there will also be a replicated Cinderbolt Storm, so healers be prepared for this. Lastly, Sol will cast Spatial Compression. This is a slow traveling arcane orb at the furthest player. I highly recommend having a ranged DPS in your group stand as far as possible to bait this. Once it lands, it's going to grip players towards its center. When this overlaps with Glacial Fusion, I recommend running towards the landing location to avoid getting hit by the Glacial Fusions. When it overlaps with Cinderbolt Storm though, I recommend running away from it or like at an angle to avoid getting hit by swirls. The final boss of this instance has been reworked and it's a nice change. Tanks will want to make sure they pick up the boss's threat and have him facing a static direction, since he will cast a pretty large frontal cone called Colossal Blow. Anyone hit will take a large amount of nature damage and will also be stunned. I personally recommend facing him towards the edge of the cliff or the wall. While there are no active adds, Yalnu will be taking 300% increased damage thanks to the Kirin Tor casting Brushfire. Occasionally Yalnu will spawn a Flourishing Ancient. This ad has a pretty nasty frontal, so melee DPS need to watch out for this. While this ad is active, players will not have the damage amplifier from the Cure and Tor, so it's in your best interest to swap to defeat this as fast as possible. Yalnu will then begin to cast Genesis, creating a field of Sproutlings. All players of your party should make it a priority to trample every single Sproutling. You can do this by simply walking over the flowers. The goal here would to have, well, 0 spawn, so Yalnu is always taking 300% increased damage. If any do happen to spawn, tank just needs to be sure to pick up threat, and everyone should focus on killing the ad. After your little gardening extravaganza, you successfully saved Stormwind for like the 30th time. Congrats. Big shout out to all my Patreon supporters who get early access to this video. Best of luck in those keys, and happy dungeoneering. Peace.